Right. You can pull that back though if you need to.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not getting started yet. Don't worry. You can keep talking. Yeah. Oh, well, no pressure, huh?
Have you done this before?
I did do one, did a couple in Austin. It's called a pre-pub event, so before the book comes out, and then another one in Missouri.
In Missouri.
Missouri at the Truman Foundation in Liberty, Missouri.
Where are you from?
I grew up here.
Oh, you're from Tulsa.
You're going to learn a little bit more
You're
about me.
spoiling the show.
You're going to learn a little bit more.
But do you live here now?
No, I live in Boston. That is not in the book. That's on the book jacket. I live in Boston.
Do you have an accent? Do you develop an accent?
No. My wife and I are like accentless. Yeah, we're both in Boston.
Where's your wife from?
She also is from where my parents are from. We're going to get into it. I love the excitement, though. I love it. What's your name?
Norman.
Norman. That's my dad's name.
What are you naming Norman?
My dad's name is Norman.
Your dad's name Norman?
All the way back there.
Hi, Norman. You're a fine guy. We got to stick together, you know?
So it's going to start when Jeff walks in, the guy with the cowboy hat. The guy with the Brooklyn aesthetic, the Williamsburg hipster aesthetic, that when he walks in and starts talking, that's when we're all going to stop talking. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get into it. Oh, I'm going to get into it.
I was a teacher.
Oh, yeah, I went to a small school. I'll talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. And everybody looks familiar.
Yeah.
We need to be hiding somewhere. We gotta hide you somewhere. We'll ask you all the questions.
Where did you teach? I taught at Madison.
Wow, that is beautiful.
Brandon, I'm going to use your book just to do an excerpt.
Let me get this out real quick. There's a random receipt. I didn't want that to fall.
No worries. I appreciate you.
That'll be my bookmark.
There you go.
Reminds me of where I was, what I was doing.
Okay.
Sometimes I use Southwest Airlines. That's what used to be my bookmark.
There you go.
That I was on the plane.
But I don't always remember. I remember vaguely remember the name. Yeah, after 20 or 30 years.
Huh?
Oh, we got an overflow section going on. Yes.
Yeah.
That's great. Good job.
It is.
It's almost showtime.
I appreciate it. What time do we get started?
7:05. I think that's what it said.
Okay.
Yeah. But you know it doesn't start until he comes in here. So.
Not taking up 2 chairs. Not.
So everyone, even though I'm supposed to be like focused on reading and talking to you all and hopefully engaging with you in some interesting conversation, because my mother is up front and she, as old as I get and as big as I get, she can still dictate to me what to do. She told me to it's gonna be real awkward. I'm gonna point at someone and tell them to come, but I need your help in doing so. I wanna embarrass her a little bit. Her name is Tanisha, okay? So on 3, we're gonna say, come up front, Tanisha. Are we ready? 1, 2, 3.
Come up front, Tanisha.
Come on, there you go. It's my mom's friend. We just wanted to embarrass her a little bit. Loosen up. We're going to talk about heavy topics. We don't want to be too serious. You guys ready to go?
Ready to roll.
All right, hey everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. Always great to see a crowd of folks here in what we call our Algonquin room, and especially in this let's call it post, this late COVID period. What are we calling this? But we had so long where this room was dark, and we had tables in here. This was kind of our shipping room, where when we were sending books out and people weren't coming in the store, this was like our little Santa's workshop kind of situation here. But this is what it was meant for, was having people in here for important events like tonight's. Got a couple things coming up I want to tell you about. So on June 21st, we're going to be over at TU at the Lorton Performance Hall with Dan Pfeiffer, who is one of the co-hosts of Pod Save America. He was Obama's communications director. He's got a new book out called Battling the Big Lie, and obviously you know what that's about. And make sure to tune in tomorrow night. Get your popcorn, get your cocktails ready for those live hearings tomorrow night. So that should be interesting. And then, how many of you came to see Nicole Hannah-Jones last week? We do have a few signed copies of the 1619 Project up in the front there. What a special night that was. It was a wonderful way to get to team up with our friends at Fulton Street, the Black Wall Street Legacy Festival, Black Wall Street Times, our friend Neo here, and of course Booker T. Washington High School, which is always a great venue. We hadn't been there since we hosted Stacey Abrams a few years ago, pre-COVID, so that was a really special evening. So thank you if you did make it out to that. Gosh, I have been looking forward to this event. I got a copy of this book somewhat early.
Before me.
It's not fair. That's just not fair. But it's something, when I read Caleb's cover story on the New York Times Magazine featuring Mother Randall with wonderful portraits by Oklahoma photographer Raheem Fortune last year, just about this time last year, I have kind of been anticipating this book ever since. And, we just, of course, passed the 101 anniversary of the massacre. And what's so great about the timing of this book, I believe, is that, there was so much around the centennial. I think many of us want to make sure that investigation, that work, that acknowledgement still continues. And having this book come out now, I think will just keep those wheels turning and keep that conversation going. A lot of people know that the Killers of the Flower Moon and the Osage Reign of Terror was happening at the same basic time as the Tulsa Race Massacre. And who was going to tell the story of the kind of intersection between the indigenous populations and black population here in Tulsa? And Caleb has done something I don't know if any of us could quite do, is kind of put some magic together in this book to tell a story that hadn't been told before in a way that gives you a lot of information, but you don't feel like you're going to school, right? It's a very readable book, and that takes a lot of skill as a writer. So we're in this place here on the corner of Archer, and this building was built in 1925. And of course, we are in historic Greenwood. So what was here before, just in case you're curious, was a ballpark called Association Park. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the history of this space. It was built in early 1900s, and I just want to tell you something about it that you may not know. So there was this whole block was a ballpark, and like I said, it was called Association Park. And in 1914, so my friend Jake Cornwell is a baseball historian here in town, and he said Association Park was the first ballpark in Tulsa to be intentionally segregated in 1914. Jim Crow segregation policies, of course, had existed prior to that, but a 1914 incident was the first publicly threatened boycott that if bleachers were not built before the next homestand to remove African Americans from the shaded grandstand, the white patrons would collectively refuse to ever attend those baseball games. And the owner had the bleachers built before the next home game, and that was a major incident. It kind of shows the pathway that 6 years later where we ended up. So there's, of course, this space has a lot of history to it, and we want to pay homage to the people that were here before us. Tonight, it's always a great pleasure to welcome my buddy Nehemiah Frank, the editor of the Black Wall Street Times, in to sit in and be a moderator for us tonight. I'm going to let him take it from here, but gosh, what a special opportunity to be launching this book in Tulsa with Caleb. Let's give everyone a big round of applause. Caleb Gayle.
Hello. Is this thing working? Is it on?
It's the other direction.
Now it's
Yeah.
It's set off. I don't. So it is a pleasure to be here with all of you here at Magic City Books. As he had mentioned, my name is Nehemiah Frank. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Black Wall Street Times, just 2 doors down. I am also a native Tulsan. My family on my mother's side came to Tulsa during the 40s. And on my father's side, they were here before the massacre. They stayed during the massacre, and they're still here today. And so it is a pleasure to be a part of this conversation, seeing that I am also of Creek descent as well. My first great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, she was a full Creek American Indian, and she spoke Full Creek. She translated. So when I saw this book come out, I was just floored. It was the first time that I had actually seen a book and delved into a book that records that history of my family. And so it's really a pleasure to be here in this space with Caleb. So we want to thank Magic City Books and Riverhead Books for allowing us to be able to be here in this space. Caleb Gayle is an award-winning journalist who writes about race and identity, a professor at Northeastern University. He is a fellow at New America, PEN America, Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and a visiting scholar at New York University. I don't know what I've been doing with my time, but he's been busy, clearly. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and other publications. He's the son of Jamaican immigrants and son of Tulsa. Gayle is a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, the University of Oxford, and has an MBA and a master's in public policy, both from Harvard University. He now lives in Boston. Everybody, welcome Caleb. All right, Caleb, so you ready to read an excerpt from your book?
Sure. How are we all doing, first of all? So a few things. I think, one, it's important to say it's good to be home. It's good to be in a place that before I went to college, none of this existed. I mean, most of us who grew up in Tulsa remember when you just didn't come here. All there was like Spaghetti Warehouse, the Gypsy coffee. So it's just amazing to kind of see a place like this, like Magic City, which I couldn't have believed would be here, but that exists though both as like a fount of knowledge and learning, but also as a place of remembrance, right? So I really appreciate also Jeff for kind of laying out and kind of laying the stakes for us, the historical stakes that provide even greater insight into who we are, because what this book does is it asks us kind of who have we been so that we might contemplate who we might become, right? So that's the fundamental thing of this book. So I'm going to read to you very briefly, because I don't want to bore you, and I don't want to give away the book, right? I want you to buy the book in spades. I want you to dive into it. I want you to wrestle with it. I want you to disagree with it. I want you to find yourself in it as well, okay? So the first part that I'm going to read, I'm going to give you a few caveats, right? So there are quite a few jarring elements and words that are going to jilt you, not make you feel comfortable. It's okay. We're all grown. It's going to be all right, okay? We're going to be all right? Yes? Yes, thank you. Also, I've never read while having to speak into 2 mics, so this is going to get interesting. So bear with me as I kind of navigate doing just that. Does that work? Bear with me. We're going to be patient, right? Great. So I'm going to read for you a couple of pages from the introduction. And to answer Norman's question, you want to go ahead, wait for us, Norman? Wait, there it is. Norman had a lot of questions about who I am beforehand. And so part of the reason I read the introduction is because unlike kind of usual works of journalism, I inject myself a little bit into the story to provide kind of a safe passage for those who would otherwise not understand or remember or know of this history. Does that work? Cool. So one last caveat. I have a million of them. So I'm the grandson of a preacher, okay? And my father, though he might not claim it, can like go in when it comes to preaching. And I didn't just grow up going to church and hearing preaching. I grew up in a black church, right? And so as such, I'm gonna like look to you like for some response, even when the response is just implied. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna say, hello. You know, I'm gonna expect you to jump in, right? So feel comfortable. There are also other black people, thank you. There are other black people here who I know go to church, and so they're gonna be used to it. So just follow their lead, you'll be all right. All right. So the introduction. The introduction is called I Got Indian in Me. It seemed that to capture the multiplicity, contradictory nature of this past, I would have to tell at least two stories. Sketch two histories, enter two worlds, enlist two purposes, and sound two calls for justice at once. And that's by Dr. Taya Miles, the GOAT of this work. My Jamaican family moved from New York City to Tulsa, Oklahoma in the late 1990s. With few expectations, or at least for me, with few expectations of running into another black person. In a place that at the time was far less black than the New York that we left, we were desperate to find people whose skin resembled ours and the institutions that could make us feel at home. Soon after moving, my parents found a black church in North Tulsa, the part of the city where most of the black people live and the place where 70 years earlier, Black Wall Street once stood tall and sprawled wide. Now, as you can tell, this is very much written, that portion, for those who are not from Tulsa. So a lot of this is gonna feel like kindergarten. Bear with me. Anyways, when I was a kid there, most of these black folks, especially those who had some history in this buckle of the Bible Belt, were known to say a peculiar and delicate phrase that now sounds so familiar. I got Indian in me. Their ancestors likely included people who had called one of the five nations home. I didn't know it then, but the five nations were actually called the five civilized tribes, an even more indelicate way of designating designating the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Indians in Oklahoma since at least 1866. But the kids who'd say that likely did not know this history, and neither did I. They passed as simply black. At least I thought they did. As a child, I thought that black people in America came from only a few places, from Africa and recently from a Caribbean country like my parents, also recently, or by way of slave ships from the African continent hundreds of years ago. I assumed the kids who said, I got Indian in me, were spreading myths or trying to explain why their skin was somewhat lighter and their hair a bit curlier than mine. But I dismissed these ideas too early. Those kids didn't know the historical power they wielded in that phrase, because what they were saying was a simple sentence born of a strange and forgotten history, one hard to imagine in the bright bustle of the turn millennium America. Even in the second decade of the 21st century, as Oklahoma fights over land, as courthouses hear challenges over identity, and as even Congress is called to admit a new Cherokee representative, it is hard to grasp, but it is true. What my young friends didn't know when they boasted about their DNA was that their native and black ancestors walked hundreds of miles together from the southeastern United States to reach what became Oklahoma. Nor did they know that some of these black ancestors came as slaves, others as adopted citizens, and still others as fully recognized members of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And I'm willing to bet that none of them ever heard the name of one black man, a former putative slave, who walked the Trail of Tears, a man named Cow Tom, by his a former putative slave who walked the Trail of Tears, a man dubbed Cow Tom by his former owner, Creek Chief. Like countless Native Americans, Cow Tom made that long, dangerous trek before he ultimately rose to leadership within the nation. In fact, it was Cow Tom who kept my friend's Creek identity intact when he renegotiated an 1866 treaty with the US government, an agreement that included citizenship rights for all black people within the Creek Nation, whether slave, adopted, or free. It may seem odd that a son of Jamaican parents would find his way inside American history, especially inside the history of black people about whom you've likely never heard, in a state you've likely never visited does not apply to this room. Clearly. Like all history, though, how it started wasn't how anyone expected it to end. One day in 2018, I was sitting in the New York office of the British newspaper, The Guardian. I'd worked there as a writer for 4 or 5 months. On this day, I was jostling between empty rooms and unoccupied desks while more senior writers and editors went to meetings, lunches, and vacations. I had no story on the books, and my editor and I had a meeting soon to figure out what I'd write next. Sat at my computer and typed in, this is gonna be familiar for all of you, www.tulsaworld.com into my web browser, not because I was looking for inspiration, but because I wanted a reminder that people could cover news and write stories about places and people most of the world didn't care about. What came up across the top of the Tulsa World's homepage were familiar faces and a story that claimed that Black people in the accompanying picture had been members of a nation that wasn't the United States and had freedom that their ancestors had given them in the Muskogee Creek Nation, but not in the United States. I was intrigued and called some of my friends I grew up with, many of whom had told me when we were kids that they were part Indian. I knew I had a story, but I didn't realize the piece I'd eventually write for The Guardian would lead me on a journey that reconfigured my notions of identity, race, and belonging. Looking back, it is odd that I wrote a story about Oklahoma, a place that honestly I wanted to forget, and a state whose mere mention often prompted any friend from anywhere else to ask, where is Oklahoma again? And in telling you about the place that became my home, I can tell you about America and how America fashions its identity. And if the story has shown me anything, it's that there's nothing simple about who you are or where you come from. Like the people on the front page of the Tulsa World, descendants of Cow Tom and other Black citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation, we are all beautifully complex. There's nothing more American than struggling to fit all that complexity into boxes you did not create in the first place. You want me to keep on going or should I stop? What should we do? Shall I keep going or shall I stop? You want to keep going?
Keep going.
Wonderful. So just really quick. It's gonna be really quick. We often forget who we are because we have never been given the chance to remember properly. The anti-lynching memorial at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, offers a radical chance to remember not just the highlights of the civil rights movement, but also the true pain and brutality of our nation's past. Such painful remembering of the violence that white people perpetrated against Black people is required before we can build true racial reconciliation. And remembering with eyes wide open, I believe, is the first step to living out our moral obligations today. The fact that my classmates and I in Tulsa in the late 20th century didn't understand where we came from wasn't just bad schooling. It was the result of a deliberate attempt to prevent us from remembering, which is another way of saying that from an early age, Black people were stopped from working to change a world that had been built on racialized and violent foundations. But what if we did know? What if we all knew about this story? Knowing this history would make the truth clearer. Know, for example, how Tulsa struggles over land use development and zoning mask a larger story, one where city planners deliberately designed the city to ensure that different non-white populations would compete with one another instead of banding together to push back against the white ruling class. We know that the Cherokee people have as much right to seat a representative in Congress as do Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. And they have this right based on signed treaties with the US government, which the government has chosen to ignore. We know that the Black members of the Creek Nation who were ejected from the tribe in 1979 should be reinstated into the political homeland. Nothing should be allowed to nullify the cultural promise and legal compact between the founding nation and its new members, no matter their race or background. And we know once and for all that white power and white supremacy are as old as the nation itself, and as dangerous today as they were centuries ago. The history of Cow Tom's people demonstrates that white identity is too often used as a tool to divide those who are deemed other, irrelevant, or even dangerous. And we know that white supremacy's true goal is to violently disrupt lives where there is money to be made and to erase from our collective cultural and political memories any path to becoming American that white men didn't create. At the same time, knowing this history also makes some ideas less clear. For example, it's an open question just how the descendants of Creek freedmen identify today. Some see themselves as Black, others as indigenous, others as both. and others as simply American because they, like most of us, just don't know whence they came. How should the country at large see these people? What duties does the government have to such an aggrieved, narrowly defined group of people? Do these labels even matter? And perhaps the broadest question of all, what is the past and future of identity in America? For himself and his family, Tom secured land, built a home, and even grew wealthy. He left his family the guarantee of full citizenship in the Creek Nation, even when the US government did not provide blacks the same courtesy. He left for his descendants breadcrumbs to guide them on their journey, to define their identity, tools to advocate for the citizenship he helped secure. Tom founded a home for black people in the Creek Nation. Like so many of the founders of the United States, what he left us is more than just words on a constitution or platitudinous statements of values and treaties, ancestors with famous pedigree, or artifacts from his life. He left the Creek Nation a chance to be better and his people a way to be freer. He left all of us an incredible story that once we learn it, we must then refuse to forget. We must hold fast, like this family has held fast, to the stories that make us who we are. I'll pause there.
Yeah. Very good. So when I first started digging into this book, for me, whenever I pick up any book, it's easier for me to read it and to understand it and to relate to it if I can see myself in the book, right? Or if I can relate to some of the characters in the book. And so it's Creek freedmen, Creeks, black folks walking from the southeastern part of the United States. I hate to say this, but I live in Georgia today, right? My family's still here, so I go back and forth. And I live in Stone Mountain. And so I remember telling people that I lived in Stone Mountain. They're like, oh my gosh, the Confederacy, but there was so much more to that space. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered why I had this piece about being in that space. And it's because the Creeks were there. Mm-hmm. I texted my grandmother, I said, Grandma, did you know that, our people came from Western Georgia? She said, yeah, my mother told me that her tribe came from there. And so I just kind of paused and sat with that. But the only reason why I decided to dig into that history is because of this book. So thank you for giving me that gift.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then another thing that is really interesting about this book, this read, is that, we know about the date 1619, but we don't even know about 1530. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So 1530, let's step back a little bit. So let's honor some of the folks who gave us information even when the world wasn't ready for it. So Angie DeBow was a historian. Some of you, oh yes, I came to the right room. People were like nodding. They were like, oh yeah, we know her. And we know also the University of Oklahoma was uninterested in publishing her work for a very long time. We know that it took Princeton intervening to do so. It's interesting the carriers of knowledge oftentimes, especially knowledge that indicts America or indicts our linear fashion for how we think we came to be who we are and where we are oftentimes mollified, right? But Angie DeBow, her groundbreaking work in the book, The Road to Disappearance, kind of focuses a little bit in the earlier portion about how DeSoto came to the States. He had quite a few people who looked a little bit like me on board, and of course had stripped them of much of their humanity. And those folks interacted with the Coosa tribe, which is a part of the federation of tribes that then became amalgamated into what's called the Creek Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation. And those folks saw the state in which these black folks were in, and they thought to themselves, perhaps we don't like this, right? And they accepted them oftentimes, and they lost all of the kind of vagaries that came with being a slave and became members of that tribe or married into that tribe. And so Angie DeBow kind of chronicles this history of an interaction that far predated what we might see in our textbooks or what we might hear in our conversations about American history. Because it was a history that existed before America was America.
All right. So you are a son of Jamaica, a son of Tulsa at the same time, right?
Sure.
So Cal Tom is one of the reasons why you're interested in this history. Like, what about his story was so fascinating and that made you just want to dig into his history?
Sure. So I think let's step back a little even further, right? So I'm a journalist, right? And then so I like don't I mean my wife has the enviable of being married to a journalist. It sucks for her, I'm sure. But no, just kidding. I think for a lot of us, we find ourselves like curious about things that others aren't, right? I might see a hole in a wall and think to myself, how did that hole get there? How can we write a story about that, right? So then hearing about someone like Cal Tom, what was interesting to me about him as I started to do research is that it didn't seem to me from the archives that I was able to dive into, from the oral history, that he was someone itching for the opportunity to lead. I don't think he had the good narcissism. There's a guy named Ray Owens here who loves to use that term, right? Where good narcissism, this notion that like he wanted to promote himself in the hopes of promoting an agenda for goodness for more people, right? That didn't seem to be the goal. The goal seemed to be, how can I establish myself? It was a very quintessentially, like, not even American question, but a quintessentially human question, right? But for a lot of us, answering that question, right, how do I establish myself? How do I make it? How do I exist and belong? Just like harder to answer, right? And with a straight face, that with any sort of certainty that you will in fact make it, right? Because there are obstacles in the way. So for me, the reason I was interested is that while I might have been telling a story that began with Cal Tom, I ended up being able to tell a larger story and ask and answer larger questions about who gets to be part of this experiment here in America, who gets to be part of the narrative of belonging, right? Because I think all of us feel that way, whether it's trying to fit in school, whether it's trying to, something that feels trivial like fitting in school, or trying to perhaps feel themselves as members of a community or what have you. It's a quintessential question that exists far beyond the borders of just this country. So in telling his story, I was able to kind of tell a lot of our stories, right? One in which we are oftentimes frustrated realizing that answering the question of who gets to belong sometimes can be incredibly unsatisfying, can be incredibly devastating. And there's more that we can do to unlearn the things that block people from being fully a part. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to folks?
Absolutely. Okay. The Creek government prior to colonialization, can you talk a little bit about that? When I was reading, I had the assumption, before I read the book, and I haven't had a chance to finish it yet, but I had the assumption that Africans who were enslaved by tribes were abused, that they were, I had this very narrow-minded idea of it, right, until I read the book. So I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll talk at a higher level and give you a few like breadcrumbs, so then you're like, oh my God, I have to get this book. So it's like the trick of any author at any event. It's like, I'm gonna tell you enough to make you want some more, right? So I think like, let's take the word, colonization away for a moment. It's preloaded with a lot of interesting things. It was colonization, to be clear, right? But for a lot of people who were not Black, who were not of any of these nations who came first and who were here first, the word was often civilization. And that's very important, right? Because that word is very dangerous, right? Because if all of a sudden, let's say that I say that I'm the civilized one, all of you who don't share my characteristics get to be a whole range of things, right? You get to be less human, you get to be savage, you get to be the people who need to be helped. And we do this a lot, right? We don't just do it for people who don't live in this country, we do it for folks who live on a certain part of town. And we say, oh, we need to help those people. Because oftentimes the most threatening versions of colonization and civilization were branded as help, right? There's a guy who you'll meet in the book named Henry Dawes. Anybody know that name, right? What a jerk, right? Because Henry Dawes, in the late 1800s, having been a senator from the great state of Massachusetts, where I live, the Bay State, went to this very like elitist conference with all of his buds in Lake Mohonk in New York. Beautiful lodge, beautiful. And he I'm not gonna tell you exactly what he said, but I'm gonna paraphrase. He's like, look, we have just fixed the black people problem. We've gotten rid of slavery. Kudos to us. They all did a round of applause. They probably did some shots. They probably said, we've made it, right? And then they decided we now need to turn our attention to the savages, right? And we need to make it such, in his words, make it such that the Indian is no longer distinguishable from the white man, right? So we need to assimilate him. We need to kind of mollify all of the things, all of the customs, all of the characteristics, the traditions, the rich tapestry, the land holdings, everything that makes folks who they are, such that we can then say, oh, they're just like one of us, right? We were a bit beyond repair. Black folks were never gonna be, not what we are to some folks, right? But we were helped. And so people like Henry Dawes, or even someone before him, who I write about extensively, named Benjamin Hawkins, who advised the first 4 presidents of the United States, was dispatched to the very area where Nehemiah now lives to effectively civilize folks, right? To introduce them to ways that were more efficient when in actuality they were dilutive, right? So to some great extent, right, what we see as perhaps colonization was passed off as something that they thought was more banal, which was civilization, which it's not. And we adapt those practices all of the time in the ways in which we help people, the ways in which we infantilize people, the way in which we make people savage, the way in which we make people just a little less human so that we can put ourselves in the enviable position of making someone else more human, right? Every time we clutch our purses when we see a certain type of person walking our way, right? Every single time we say to ourselves, oh, that one guy, in school, we got to work on him, right? Every single time we do that, we're just repeating in perhaps lighter forms, perhaps more pernicious ones because they're more subtle, a lot of the same tactics that a lot of colonizers did to so many people who weren't just like them. Was that clear? Was that heavy? I'm so sorry.
That was brilliant, bro. That was amazing. All right, well, are there any questions? Do we have anyone that has questions out there?
What's your name?
My name is Ben Zoll. On the back of that, how should we help? Should we not help? I mean, if there are people that are less fortunate than us.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question.
How do we do it without being perceived as the civilizer, as the colonizer?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think there's nothing wrong with the impulse to help, to want to be helpful. There's nothing about that that's wrong. I think when we think that we have to fundamentally change something quite unchangeable, like who that person is, in order for them to be helped, is where something goes awry, right? That's like the danger I think we find ourselves in more often than we think, right? Like the person who says to themselves, I'm going to go to the hood and try to, for instance, change the music that we listen to, change the places that people have the desire to go to. I'll give you a great example. Can I give you a great example? So what was that?
It was funny.
Yeah, okay. Norman found it funny. So I'll give you a great example of a policy meant to help. So I did a lot of reporting in Milwaukee, right? Which was a particular zip code, 53206, which was feloniously called the most incarcerated zip code in America. And of course it wasn't, right? But no matter. At any rate, when they did that, right, it became a part of town that needed to be helped. The way in which they thought we might help people, right, was by implementing these silly laws, municipal laws, that were implemented not just by the city of Milwaukee, but also some of the surrounding counties called wild counties. I'm getting to my point, don't worry, it's gonna be there in just a second. But what I will say, what I will say is that those laws were fundamentally trying to get people to change there. So for instance, if you were loitering on your stoop, your own home, you could be arrested. If you wanted, for instance, to chew gum in your community, you would be arrested. And that was seen as helping people. That was improving who they were, right? Without actually identifying the root causes, without listening to the community, without understanding the history that got them there, without understanding that, for instance, during the height of redlining, that community was known as like a Negro slum district. And so as such, every policy dating back to the 30s was constructed to ensure that that part of Milwaukee would never have the success that we wanted. So instead of addressing the issues that brought us there, right, we instead tried to change those people, right? And I think the one thing I'll say is part of the reason I'm using the word we a lot is because we're kind of all complicit, right? And it doesn't necessarily make us evil people. It's just that we watched it happen. We watched it happen all of the time. And by saying we, I involve all of us in the process of making it better. And so we see that happen throughout history. It's just a recent occurrence in the case of Milwaukee, right? And it dates back for as long as I can remember, not even I can remember, but that I care to do research into, right? Which is a long time, right? We started by talking about 1530. It's been going on for quite some time. So I think we should always help people, but I think we do so first by listening. We do so first by understanding what got us here, by doing the root cause analysis in partnership with the people we're trying to help. And that alone is the way I think in which we help people in a way that's useful.
I would say take the word help out of our vocabulary because of the power dynamics
Yeah.
that are inherent in that word. And I would say you have to walk and work alongside people instead of trying to help.
I completely agree. What was your name, by the way?
I'm Jen.
Jen, thank you. I appreciate you kind of providing that uplift to that recommendation. Yes.
Caleb, in writing this book and thinking about like the near future in Tulsa, how do you want readers, or how might readers read this text, look to history to kind of help us think through a path forward given all of the interpersonal, intercultural challenges we still have yet to solve?
You want to ask that question in a more direct way? Ashley, I know Ashley really well. So she has a tendency, even in text messages, to like ask questions like this, and I'm like, yeah. So what are you asking? What are you asking, Ashley?
Without giving away too much details, the lessons that we learned from this text, what should we take from it?
Sure. The main impulse here is that boxes were created, categories were constructed to try to sort people into boxes they never ever asked anyone to create, that could not fully contain the broad yet comprehensive and complex narratives that define their identities, right? That we actually get out of the practice of trying to come up with markers of identity, but rather we just learn from people. I think I can say this as a Tulsan, and I don't care. I can shoot from the hip. Or can I shoot from the hip? I'm looking to you with the green mask, in part because I love your mask. You right there, yeah. I love the mask, and you're like giving me a lot of. I feel it. Anyways, so I think like in Tulsa, right? I think that there is this impulse, similar to everywhere else, but I think strongly felt here in Tulsa, where we really, really want to reconcile on matters of race. Let's get there. Let's get there quickly. Boom, we're all happy together. Boom, it's all good. And I think what the work of people like Nehemiah, the work of people who have been here, who are no longer here, it forces us to be okay with indicting ourselves for A, not knowing the history in the first place, and B, realizing that the histories that bring us to this point are worth excavating, they're worth exploring. They're worth sitting with the truth of what has happened to propel us then to start thinking about what ways do we atone, and then in what ways do we repair for it, right? So I think perhaps this story, along with many other stories, right? Luckily I'm not like throwing my book out there into a vacuum, but hopefully in conversation with so many other people that perhaps we realize that in order to experience true reconciliation, we first must have truth. And the reason I say it's uniquely Tulsa, a uniquely American issue, is because so many other countries have realized their Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that it's perfectly okay to be very sad about some things that happen, but also to recognize that even on the margins of society, people found, as my boy Kiese Lehman would say, found ways to live abundantly, right? And so what you're gonna see in this book are people living abundantly in ways that I can't even imagine, in ways that are completely and totally uncharacteristic of the things that we see now, right? If we look at the data about the average net worth of black folks, right, it's going to be depressing now. We're gonna see people in this story who didn't have that problem, right? You're gonna see people, you're gonna see like the average rate of home ownership now amongst black people. You're gonna look at this book and you're gonna be like, oh, wow, this is different. And I think hopefully, right, it gives us the opportunity to increase, and you and I have talked about this several times, I think we need more heroes. And I don't think we have to look too far. In fact, we have to look at the history of even this place to find some incredible heroes, right? Because I think for me, as a black kid going to school, I don't think I knew much about many black heroes. I didn't hear about that. The last thing I'll say, which is a little bit more political, is that especially in this time with this governor, in this state, at this point in time, right, with the impulse, like Florida's governor, like many other governors, to try and limit, to try and mollify the excavation of these stories, right, this is the exact time to engage in an act that I wouldn't have ordinarily thought to be radical, but it is now, which is just to remember. So if perhaps we can start there, perhaps then the conversations can be more interesting. Because I used to hate when people would say, let's have a conversation about race, and let's have another conversation. I think those conversations are bereft of utility, in part because we don't spend the time to first remember. So I hope that this book, if anything, just gives us the opportunity to do that very thing, that radical thing, which is to remember. And Nehemiah's looking at his watch, so I'm gonna get him, go ahead, start calling on folks, sorry.
Another question in the back.
Ooh. He's on his Bob Barker today. I love it.
Thanks so much.
What's your name?
My name is Colleen.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Good to meet you. Thanks for being here. Following up on what you just said about like moving beyond conversation, and also what are the takeaways from this book and this larger conversation. You know, you were talking about like what we in Tulsa need to do and the reconciliation that needs to happen here. But what at a political level, what at a governmental level, and I'm talking specifically about the tribes, what would you like to see the tribes doing? Because not only is there this kind of erasure of, let's not talk about the freedmen issue, right? But also there is anti-blackness in a lot of the tribes. And so I'm wondering, like, what is the action? What are the best steps forward? Do you have any ideas?
So one of the best aspects, I'm not avoiding your question, I'm going to answer it very directly, but I'm going to caveat it like this. One of the benefits of being a journalist is that I get to be the person who says, oh, this is terrible. Well, who wants to do something about it, right? And so part of the work, I think, though, of journalism, part of the reason journalism is perhaps under attack right now in our country, news media is under attack of all forms, is in part because the goal of a free press is oftentimes to hold to account those who are in power. It's kind of, I think that's the fun part to me. I enjoy doing that. I don't enjoy trying to implement policy, right? However, I told you I was going to answer the question directly. One thing I would say, a few things. One thing I would say, I was talking, is going to be a name dropping moment. So we're going to get past it. It's not me being braggadocious. I'm bad at it. Ask Ray Owens in the back. Or ask Ken. I'm really bad at bragging about myself. So I was having a conversation with Natalie Diaz. Ooh, yeah, Pulitzer Prize winning poet, right? Who is perhaps one of the best thinkers, I think, right? And we were talking about the question of anti-blackness and indigeneity. And I think that there's a much more complex history and a set of politics that I don't fully understand. But I will say this very direct thing is that where anti-blackness exists, there really can't ever be, I think, true freedom, right? So let me explain what I mean by that. I think that something that Nicole Hannah-Jones says a lot, something that Ta-Nehisi says a lot is, I'm going to paraphrase, is that like resistance from the margins is the most American form of democratic participation, right? The decision to say to the face of power when you seemingly have none, that either I get included or we're gonna have some problems. Either I get included or I call into question the lofty goals and the platitudes that you offer on paper in policy statements. I think so long as anti-blackness, anti-anything exists within an institution, that institution will never truly understand freedom. And I think if you're not obsessing with how we can make people who have a claim somewhere belong, if that's not your obsession, if that's what you're not fighting for, I worry about the very foundational elements of how any institution of any kind will ever operate. So does that, I mean, that's like both tough and vague at the same time, because I'm still wearing my journalism hat. Catch me afterwards, or as the person would say, catch me outside, and we can have a more frank conversation about what specified policy measures might be interesting to discuss. Thank you, Colleen.
We have another question.
Hi there. Can I get your name?
Gary Lee.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too. I'm the editor of the Oklahoma Eagle.
Oh yeah, awesome. Thank you, by the way. I'm sorry. Real quick, can I say something? Thank you so much. No, I mean it in part because, you know, part of the way I found my light in these books that I'm writing is predominantly because of Black newspapers, right? So I just wanted to say thank you.
And you're welcome, and thank you for your book. Many of us who are descended from Creek Freedmen would wonder if in your research you came to a sense of what is a Creek Freedman, how they are different from, let's say, Cherokee Freedmen.
Sure.
Or other people who were freedmen or other Black Indians. Do you have a sense of that? Can you tell me what a Creek Freedman looks like?
I am, so that will give away a good chunk of the book, right? And
You can give breadcrumbs.
I'm gonna give a few breadcrumbs. I'll give you one. I think it's interesting whenever I like talk to DeMario Solomon Simmons, who's directly descendant from Cal Tom, he really rebuffs, and I think in a really interesting way, using the term Creek Freedman to cast a net for all people who might be descendant from those who were once citizens of the Creek Nation. In part because in his mind, and I don't want to misquote him, but in his mind, oftentimes it feels as if freedman itself is not the widest term to use. Not whitest, but widest. W-I-D as in darn, E-S-T. In part because in his mind, for at least Cal Tom, there is, in his mind, a worthy reason to say that Cal Tom was never enslaved, he didn't come from enslaved people. And so by calling him a Creek Freedman and then subsequently those who are descendant from him, we might be mislabeling who he is and who then they are. Now, I am strictly a journalist and someone who also wants to make sure that I'm not going to give the full answer because I think quite a bit of it would give away the book. But I wanted to make sure that I at least answered your question at a distance, because I just don't want to. I want to make sure that people are there for the hook. But thank you. I want to say again, when I look even at historical newspapers or spending time at the Library of Congress looking at Calling of America newspapers, right? Even I think the best example. Can we just quick diversion? Most of us probably by now, after last year, are familiar with Nab Negro for Attacking Girl and Elevator, right? Which oftentimes, if we relied strictly on that, we would perhaps have a very different view of what happened here 101 years ago. But thankfully, not just here, but in towns all over the country that experience the depth of pain from various massacres, because of the persistence of Black newspapers that told a different narrative, that in my opinion did less opining and more reporting, we have a fuller view of American history that we otherwise wouldn't have. So thank you again.
So we have time for about 2 more questions.
Eli Grayson, I am a member of the Creek Nation.
Yes, sir.
And have fought for the rights of the freedmen for decades.
Good to see you again.
I will say this, one of the issues that the freedmen do have with the journalism, particularly in Tulsa, in Oklahoma, is that when we're talking about race between the races, or racism between the races, we always seem to go back to either the 21 Race Massacre or statehood. We don't go back to the Trail of Tears. We don't go back 150 years before the Trail of Tears. And so how do we get journalists to talk about, even here, we're getting ready to celebrate Juneteenth. Yet, where you're sitting, Black people were free June 14th, 1866. A year after what happened in Texas. Yet, still what's reported is June 1865. And no one talks about when slavery ended in Indian Territory. A year after. July 19, just a block up the street, 1866. So how do we get journalists to put in print these things when we're talking about Oklahoma history?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to answer this quickly because I know we don't have that much time, and I'm assuming someone else might want to ask a question. So I think that, like, look, right? I think I can't speak as well to like what journalists are doing in Oklahoma, but I think journalists generally, I think like there is a revival of sorts that many journalists who are much older than me and much grayer than me have done valiant work in, which is realizing that the reporting process is not the assemblage of voices of people who are living now only, but perhaps the diving into archives, right? And there are impressive journalists who have been doing this for a long time. It's just, look, in a deadline-driven world, in a world in which we're so rapidly just trying to get out sound bites, where the length of pieces are decreasing, where magazines are going bankrupt, where newspapers are going bankrupt, when you have those competing forces, it's just so hard, right? And so I think what things that we can do is making sure that journalists are actively, and in journalistic institutions are actively working with archival institutions to provide more and more of that. One of the projects that I work on with Jackie Woodson and Eve Ewing, Natalie Diaz, and a whole lot of others is that we are working to create, similar to what the Federal Writers Project was, a massive kind of database of oral history from those who would pass on. So this year, we're going to do over 300 interviews with people from all across the country who have lived on the margins to collect that information and make it more easily accessible, make it easily searchable, right? If any of you have looked through the Federal Writers Project, it's not the easiest thing to get through. You can't just push Control Find and type in, like, did this person say these things? But I think there's work to do. I think there's work to leverage technological resources to make it even more accessible, because these journalists, all journalists, are working under the sort of time pressures that often don't accommodate for the sort of rich work that needs to be done, right? Like it's so hard when you have an editor saying, hey, so do we have to cite this person? Hey, we don't have that much word space. Can you cut a line? Oh, by the way, I just don't know if people are going to grasp X. That nuance that you're talking about, Eli, is so critical. That's what you're asking for, right? That's what you're expecting of us. We need more nuance because I think people can handle it. And I think journalists are uniquely capable of taking that which is so deeply shrouded in nuance and making it incredibly clear for mainstream audiences. So I appreciate you even challenging me to do the same. And I think we need to identify ways to ensure that the free press has access to this sort of information in a broad way at scale. Because then I don't think you and I would be nearly as frustrated, because I am as well, with a lack of sometimes historical heft to explain the current moment.
And so my mom just texted me and she said, get me a book.
Hey, I appreciate her. Thank you.
So we have one more question.
Or if there are quick questions, we can ask them all, and I'll answer them all in one fell swoop.
Last question.
What's your name?
Anna.
It is. Oh, I couldn't see with the mask. Hey.
I just want to know what your favorite part of researching and writing this book was, and maybe your least favorite part.
Favorite part. I mean, I'm a nerd, and I think that like spending time with people, spending time in archives, spending time, tussling with folks who didn't want to talk, who are from institutions that don't necessarily appreciate this history near as much, being denied, all of that stuff is really, all that's pretty enjoyable, to be honest. I think the thing that I dislike the most, so it's the thing that I love and hate the most. So my mentor, my big brother, is someone named Kiese Lehman, and he talks a lot about revision. He wrote a book called Heavy, which is this letter to his mother. Beautiful. He subordinates the audience and says, look, y'all are just going to listen to me talk to my mom for about 80,000 words, right? And it's phenomenal. It's the best memoir I've ever read in my entire life. And one thing he talks about is revision, right? The process is just painstaking, right? Like all the work. I must have turned in about 140,000 words, and what you have in front of you is less than 80, right? That process is painful, but it's also beautiful. And the reason I love it and hate it is because it reminds me of my mom. I'm gonna embarrass her again. Y'all ready? I'm gonna embarrass my mom one more time. So when I was 6 years old during the summer, Hold on. When I was 6 years old during the summer, my mom fulfills some stereotypes. One of them being a very strict Caribbean mother, an immigrant mother who expects the best from her kids, right? And it's out of love, right? And I'm gonna try not to get emotional, but it's out of love.
Take your time. Take your time.
Right. Good job.
Yeah, it's out of a deep wellspring of love. And so during the summers, you have work to do, right? School was not over. And so summer came, and I think I was going to the second grade. I was gonna have Miss Lopez. I don't know why I remember that, but y'all have it now. And my mom always would get us these workbooks that were always like a few grades ahead. And so after I finished my work, I got the chance to watch some TV, be a 6-year-old during the summer, right? And my mother said, oh, Caleb, the story's wrapping up soon. We can go ahead and grab some books and all that stuff. But I'll tell you why I love revision. So this lovely woman says, Caleb, come here. I went over, stopped watching whatever it was, Darkwing Duck, I don't know. And I walk over to my mom and she says, Caleb, it's time to do a current events report. So I want you to look through this Wall Street Journal. It was the Wall Street Journal. And I had to look for a article to write. So I picked one in the sports section, right? And it was Lennox Lewis, who was he was starting to spread rumors that he was about to retire after a fight in London. And I did the current events report dutifully, excited, right? And I scribbled all the things down and I give it back to her proudly. Go sit down, it's back to Darkwing Duck, right? It's time to get back to my childhood that I so wanted to enjoy, but was being held hostage from doing, so I had to do it, right? So at any rate, my mom, after a while, says, oh, Caleb Joshua. That's when you know something's wrong. If she had said Caleb Joshua Gayle, it would have been over, right? But she said, in a loving way, Caleb Joshua, and I walked on over, proud, about to see this A, right? Because my mom graded summer assignments after you had finished your summer work. She gives it back to me, and all I see is red, right? And at the very top, because she loved me, and Cassie and I have talked about this, because she loved me, she put a 56.5, F+, and she circled the F+. Because she loved me. Because I don't know why she did, but because she knew the world wasn't necessarily going to be nearly as kind to me as she was. Because the world didn't necessarily value me in the way that it should. And you're going to read about a lot of people who persisted, who improvised, who almost in the style of blues and jazz that people like Imani Perry write about Lorraine Hansberry, decided to change in the moment, who decided to morph, to identify ways to become, even when people were telling them that was not allowed. And so as such, the reason I love this woman is because she taught me how to love seeing red. She taught me how to love to revise. Because I tell you what, my editor, Jake Morrissey, a lovely man, has put red in so many different places. But in so doing, it's forced me to remember that in no way are any of us complete. In no way is this project of American identity complete. In no way is the distribution of power appropriate or complete just yet. We have the duty to revise. The only way we can revise properly is if we refuse to forget. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it so very much.
Are you ready to sign books?
It's time.
All right. We'll be signing books in the back. Thank you so much, Caleb. Good job, bro. That was, ugh.